Not seen the report on the investigation into Councillor Maglioka's expenses. Where is it, and why is the city taking so long to deal with this?
It turns out that there was a bit of a technical problem relating to the release of third-party information, which is not a great answer, and I want you to have that report ASAP. I understand from my colleagues at the city that they have resolved all of the concerns, and that should be released within the hour, which doesn't really help so much for this scrum, but I will be able to at least answer some general questions, and I'll make myself available to answer more specific ones once it's out.
Okay, and I guess just to follow up, is there anything specific that you'd like to flag that you have particular concerns with over the conduct of this councillor? Again, we sort of touched on this last night, but now that there's a bit of more time has passed, what are your thoughts?
Well, as I mentioned last night, this is very troubling. It's very troubling. What we have seen is a consistent pattern of behavior over a long period of time. Everyone makes mistakes. I make mistakes. We all make mistakes. We try to fix them when they're brought to our attention. But what we've seen here is a real pattern of behavior and sort of all around the issue of expenses, but in different ways. And once you get a chance to see the report, you'll see there are things like hotel stays where there's not an immediate understanding that there was a meeting that was related to that hotel stay. You will see what we've already seen with some great reporting already around receipts with people who were not there. And as you look through this, you see that at the very best, this is a disregard, a real disregard for the rules. At the very worst, this is a pattern of behavior that I don't think is befitting of an elected official who should treat every dollar as though it is the dollar of your neighbor, because it is. This is public money, and we have to be very careful with it.
The next question is from Kevin Nimick with CTV.
Stampede is still canceled.
Oh, is it? Okay.
It
well,
never
then I
gets
don't have
old.
any more questions. Just kidding.
Go ahead.
So, Mayor, what I'm wondering, yesterday when council had this discussion, they went behind closed doors. Why did that have to be a discussion that happened behind closed doors? As obviously you're aware, these are public dollars that are, the allegations are that they're being misused. So why is that a discussion that can't happen before the public?
That's a fair question. The policy and the process is very clear. What we had to do in this case is we didn't have to, but we chose to treat this the same way as though it were in a report from the Integrity Commissioner. And the critical thing about the reports from the Integrity Commissioner is that those reports are public and they are made public. But we do need to give the person who's being complained about the chance to read it, and we do need to give council the chance to talk about sanctions. And that is really what happens in these cases. Council only got that report when we went into private session. They didn't get it in advance at all. So they needed a little bit of time to read it, a little bit of time to respond to it, and then it automatically becomes public when we rise and report.
Do you mind if I follow up on that?
Go ahead.
Okay, I was just wondering about the, now the report gets sent to a few different places, including the Office of Minister Casey Madhu. He has the power to, as I understand it, he has the power to fire a councillor. Is that something that you would be interested in seeing? It looks like Councillor Maglioka is not going to quit on his own accord, or at least he hasn't yet. Would you like to see some outside intervention?
Well, ultimately, I believe that the voters are the arbiters of this, that it's not the provincial government who is the boss of the municipal council. The voters, the citizens, are the boss of the municipal council, but that is not actually the law. The law actually does give the Minister of Municipal Affairs some powers. I actually don't know specifically what those powers are, but, we have a Minister of Municipal Affairs who often reminds us publicly that he has these roles and authorities. And so I think it's important for him to understand what the results of this investigation have been.
The next question is from Scott Dipple with CBC.
A couple of questions, Mayor. You say that there's a pattern of bad behavior. No, not had a chance to review. Can you describe what that pattern is?
This is a very Kafka-esque media scrum because I have read something that you have not read. Honestly, when I heard that you hadn't had it yet, I wanted to just read you the report. That's probably appropriate, but you will have it soon. So I will answer that question based on what I know, which I hope will be a helpful answer for you going forward. I mean, look, what we see in this report is over the period of time that was covered by the investigation, there's not one incident or two incidents. There are incidents over a long period of time that have to do with travel expenses. It is very clear that there is a pattern there. This is not, I made a mistake once, I made a mistake twice. This is a whole bunch of problematic expenses that are put in place, and I was shocked by it. You know, people may argue that the city government under my leadership has spent money in ways they like or spent monies in ways they don't like, but I will tell you that it has always been ethical and honest and open. I have been reporting my expenses and the visitors to my office and gifts received before that was required by the Code of Conduct. And, I'm not going to say I'm perfect. If you were to go through mine with a fine-tooth comb, you might find a mistake here and there. You might find a misfiled receipt. You'll certainly find a lot of missing receipts because I'm bad about losing them, especially for gas. I always lose them for some reason. But it always has been conducted in a way that has tried to be honest and open and fair and a good steward of dollars. I'm not in this for personal benefit. There are expenses that are legitimate. Of course there are. We travel a lot, or I travel a lot. Like in any workplace, there are expenses that are legitimate expenses that you should be charging to your office. I'll give you an example. I use a lot of volunteers who help me on the weekends or in the evenings. And I say, if you are volunteering to help me on the evening and the weekend, guess what? The office is going to buy you dinner or lunch. Now, sometimes that's at McDonald's or Wendy's, but I think that's a legitimate use of taxpayer money for someone who is going out of their way to help fulfill the good of the city. So there's lots of examples of that. I'm not saying expenses are illegitimate at all, but what I am suggesting is every one of those has to be undertaken with an eye to policy, but also with an eye to what's right. And I think that's where I was so surprised and so shocked by what we saw yesterday.
Now, Mayor, taxpayers might ask, what responsibility does the city bear in that it took a FOIP request, media reporting, and a forensic audit to actually detect these problems?
The audit that was done on everyone else's expenses was a very, very clean audit. It found that over this period of time, I think it looked at 2 years worth of expenses. There were basically two that weren't well documented, and once they were documented, they were fine. Out of hundreds and thousands of expenses. So by and large, everyone's doing a good job. But what troubles me about what came up in this report is that in this case, with this councillor, this stuff went on for years. And it really does mean that although the vast, vast majority of what we see is good and reasonable and proper, that there was obviously loopholes that this councillor was able to move through, and those got to get closed.
The next question is from Sarah Rieger with CBC. She asks, will the city be trying to recoup any more costs beyond what the councillor has already repaid?
There's we don't have the ability to mandate that sanction. The councillor has paid a lot of the money back, and when you see the report, you will see that, in fact, he has paid back all and then some for the expenses that were deemed ineligible. In most cases, there is one category of expenses that have not previously been looked at. It has to do with upgrades on airfare, and that remains an open question as to whether those will need to get paid back as well.
The next question is from Madeline Smith.
Sorry, just had to unmute there. Is there any desire to go farther back into Councillor Maglioca's expenses? Obviously, he was elected in 2013. So is there any discussion of having a look towards the beginning of his council term, or is this kind of adequate for you at this point?
I'm not sure what the cost benefit on that is, to be honest. We've seen a real pattern here. If we were to go further back, might we find more? We might. But these forensic audits are not cheap. I recognize that I am planting a question that I don't want to answer, but that's okay. I will say that these forensic audits are not cheap, and we have learned that there's a pattern of behavior here. I'm not sure what we would gain out of learning a lot more. I mean, I would love to, because I would love the information, but you just got to analyze that versus the cost of doing it, given that we have a very clear finding now.
And is there, how long will we be waiting to see how to close some of those gaps? I know the working group is supposed to report back by the end of the year, but specifically the gap of there are certain expenses that, unlike ward budget expenses, are not just automatically publicly reported. When can we start seeing more consistently that those are going to be made public?
Yeah, so as you've identified, we've created a working group under the auspices of the city manager, a very sort of senior working group, to create new policy on how to manage councillors' expenses. I feel the need to point out councillors' expenses, not the mayor's expenses. My expenses are already approved by our chief financial officer and go through that level of scrutiny, but councillors are not. Their expenses have been approved by a member of council. So there are a number of changes to policy that need to happen, and what I will be pushing for is the easy ones, like the one you've highlighted, that some expenses are not immediately disclosed, that those changes should just be done immediately. And they do have to report on all of the changes, as you say, by the end of the year.
A quick reminder that if you have a question, either raise your hand within the Teams app or text it to 403-333-2272. Our next question comes from Scott Dipple.
Hopefully a couple of quick ones, Mayor. Can you release the letter of reprimand to Councillor Maglioka?
Haven't written it yet, but when I do write it, it will be public.
And can you tell us if the city or council has received an apology letter from Councillor Maglioka?
Not that I know of.
Well, that was so quick. How about one more?
Okay.
Can you explain, for the public's benefit, why the sanctions from council seem to be relatively weak or a slap on the wrist?
It's because it's all we can do. Because we are dealing with an elected official here, the philosophy behind the laws that govern what we do is that citizens decide, and citizens decide at election time. So what council is capable of doing is very weak. And in fact, I would argue that the sanctions that council put forward yesterday are certainly the largest sanctions I've ever seen council put forward, and go almost to the limit of our authority. So, people are asking, can you force him to resign? Well, no, we can't. That's just not within our purview. Can you cut his salary? Well, we might be able to do that, but there are some questions around that and our ability to impose those sanctions. We actually engaged external counsel, which is not something we've done before, and you have a letter from the external counsel on helping us develop the right sanctions here. And she said, look, there is a lot of case law on what is punitive, what goes too far, what will be overthrown. There was just a case literally in the last week with Rocky View County talking about these sanctions. So these sanctions, though they feel maybe to some people like a slap on the wrist, are actually about as far as we can go. And they highlight how seriously council was taking this issue.
And we go back to Kevin Nimick.
Hi, Mayor. I just want to talk a little bit about Councillor Maglioka quickly. He has been describing himself in the past, obviously before this, as a fiscal hawk. He's asked council several times to trim the fat. How do you respond to these sorts of ironies now that we know what we know?
Well, one of the funny things about people who call themselves fiscal hawks is that they are often fiscal chicken hawks. And that's something we've seen on our council. The people who say in the abstract, cut taxes, cut taxes, cut taxes, cut spending, cut spending, cut spending. When you actually have a specific cut in front of them, they tend to vote against it, especially if it's something that they care about or something that's in their own ward. But ultimately, charity begins at home, and fiscal conservatism should begin with managing your own expense account.